Hello, I'm Octavius Smiley Humphreys, Chair of the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Council for the LGBTQ Alliance. I am honored and humbled today to present to you a wonderful conversation regarding our sponsors, some of our most amazing sponsors who have really committed to DE&I, not just with the Alliance, but they've been doing this before we were here and really making amazing strides in all of our mission, and that's providing equitable housing for all. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Kenya Burrell, who is our executive sponsor of the JEDI committee at the Alliance. Kenya, can you introduce our fabulous panel and get the conversation started?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Octavius, and thank you all for joining us today. Today, our topic is when we're all in, we all win. And there's no better way of describing this than what we're going to dive into today. As Octavius mentioned, my name is Kenya Burrell Van Warmer, and I serve as a director with the Real Estate Alliance LGBTQ+. We're glad you're joining us today, and we're going to have a conversation with some industry leaders who are not only involved in this space, but making a difference every day. Let me introduce you to our speakers. Our first is Julia Lachey Israel with Keller Williams, Ann Deisty with US Bank, and Tanya Navarez with Realogy. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. So let's just jump right into this. We've all been on this journey with diversity, equity, inclusion in the industry, in our professional lives and our personal lives. At the Alliance, we like to call this JEDI, which Octavius mentioned just a moment ago, and that's Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. How are your organizations supporting this initiative? Julia Lachey, would you like to start first?
Yes, I sure would. Thank you so much, Kenya, for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you guys. And I'm really proud to say where our journey began as Keller Williams was actually after the George Floyd murder. And like many companies, it opened people's eyes to the long-standing inequities and injustices that exist in our country. And Gary Keller, the founder of Keller Williams Realty, sent a letter out to our organization and said, hey, you know what, this is wrong. And you know what else? I don't only want to open my eyes to what injustices have been happening in the country. I'd also like to start a task force to identify any equity issues that we have internally in our company. And he created a social equity task force and requested every single region around the country name someone as their leader on this social equity task force. And from there, we began this journey of what many corporate organizations refer to as diversity, equity, and inclusion. However, my role here at Keller Williams is the head of inclusion and belonging because it's a little bit deeper than that. So that's where we started with this journey. We've got many initiatives that we've been working on since, but it gave us a really good foundation to catapult from and do all the work we're doing now.
That's great. Thank you. And Ann, US Bank is a leader in this space, not only with commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and let's add belonging to this conversation, but specifically with the LGBTQ community. Would you share with us the initiatives that are in place?
Yeah, thank you, Kenya, and so good to be here with you all. You know, it's been a journey for us too. I think just echoing what Julia had said, very similar kind of journey. I think, you know, I think about this DEI space and I consider myself fairly new to it, you know, two and a half years. But DEI for me has always been a thread in the work that I've done. You know, my background is really in sales and marketing. And, you know, I can think of instances where, you know, as a gay out person in a bank, you know, I've been made to feel uncomfortable. I've been made to feel out of place, like I didn't belong. And so, you know, this has really been a part of my personal journey too. But, you know, how we're committed to, you know, specifically in the LGBTQ space is, you know, our DEI team is really focused on making sure our LGBTQ plus employees have a voice at the company. You know, and really the core purpose of it at the bank is to make sure everyone feels included. That's literally everyone. So We have initiatives that are also client focused. So my previous role used to be leading LGBTQ client facing strategy. Again, making sure clients feel welcome when they walk into a branch, when they pick up and talk to someone at the call center, for those moments that matter too, making sure they feel part of the US Bank family. So it's been a journey for us as well. And, we're looking forward to the path ahead.
That's excellent. Not only what you're focusing on is consumer facing, but it's also interrelated facing. So the two channels there are crucially important. Thank you for sharing that. And Tanya, Trilogy.
Thank you, Kenya. Again, I appreciate the invitation to be with all of you today. Very important topic, and happy to be part of this discussion. A little bit different journey, longer, if you will. It's been 20 years that I've been with Realogy, and I remember starting early on, and I sort of had all odds against me. I was a woman that did not come from the industry, Hispanic, young at the time. And so it was just, there weren't many people that looked like me and perhaps in some cases thought like me. So I tried to better understand why that was the case. Fast forward, did a lot of research on the industry and quickly recognized that the industry, right, was so sorely underrepresented on so many dimensions of diversity. From an LGBTQ plus perspective, certainly racial and ethnic diversity, and gender in certain, ownership and leadership positions, even generational diversity at the time. So it was like just fraught with, wrong, if you will, but also tremendous opportunity. I chose the opportunity path and really made it my mission to educate, leaders and the industry at large on why we needed to come together, not as a company, but more so as an industry, and change the trajectory. And so that's what we've been focused on for the past 20 years. So certainly, when the unfortunate situation occurred over the past, 20 months or so, clearly, the murder of George Floyd, we've tripled down, if you will, on our efforts, but the journey has started long before that. From a, what we're doing perspective, early on, we recognized that, education was important. So we've really been focused on elevating the fair housing focus, not just the minimum standards, but creating sort of our own version of that to take it to new levels. That's really important in the industry. We have an ERG, we have 8 ERGs, but one of which is Real Pride. We, completely support, endorse our community. And in fact, they've become really a group that we turn to for, as a source, I should say, in social issues. And that really has, allowed us to propel. And so, we also early on were partners, if you will, with the first real estate LGBTQ plus association, and have just been partnering together now, obviously, with the Alliance on the mission ahead, and proud of doing so.
Thank you. Those are tremendous contributions to doing more in this space. You brought up a good point. There are several dimensions to diversity. And what's interesting is there are some conversations people are growing tired of hearing. Let's be honest, the conversation started, and unfortunately, these past 20 months, we know why the conversation has been accelerated. And there seems to be a growing fatigue when you mention anything that's related to DEI. What's interesting is there are several dimensions. We've talked about the LGBTQ piece, there's gender, there's ethnicity, and there's race, and more. What have you all noticed to create change in your organizations as it relates to continuing this very important conversation? To you, Julia Lachey.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it, because like you mentioned, oftentimes when we bring up diversity, people automatically assume you're talking about race. And then they're like, oh, geez, I don't want to have to talk about racism. Let's all excuse ourselves from the conversation. And it is so much more than that. It is about sexual orientation, religion, particularly in real estate. All of these things really are intricately related to homeownership. And the ways that people access homeownership, barriers that exist, and age, you mentioned. I mean, there's so many different dimensions. So the quest for me is first getting people to understand that diversity does not equal racism. Because you also mentioned the need for education, and people don't want to come to the education if they think that's what the conversation will be, not realizing that the real conversation is the benefit and beauty of diversity in business. And explaining to people why you need and leading your initiatives about your client-facing situations. And because if we all, and thank God everybody doesn't look like me and think like me and have the same ideas as me, or we would probably have a failing company. You need people from different perspectives and different ideas and different backgrounds. And Anne would offer a different experience than myself, and Tanya would have a different experience than myself. And even if we were all the same color, we would all have different experiences and backgrounds because we may not all be the same sexual orientation or the same gender or the same religious beliefs or whatever, but by us coming together, we now have a more well-rounded business. And getting people to understand that that's the conversation about diversity, not just the conversation about George Floyd, that's not, it's so much bigger than that. So for me, I've really been on this quest to first explain what diversity even is, and why we need everybody's perspective at the table. Here at Keller Williams, we have a belief system, but we added the E to it, which is equity, opportunities for all. So the conversation is about, are we ensuring that everybody has the same opportunity, regardless of whatever that dimension is? But the fatigue, I think, comes from the misunderstanding of what the conversation is even really about.
That's so true. You and Tanya both focus on education, and I think education is key to better understand what we don't know. And sometimes it's that fear of the unknown that continues to drive the confusion or the fatigue that individuals are feeling. But I agree with you 110%. Diversity of thought, diversity of perspective are crucial in any business moving forward. And what's interesting is there have been cases and studies like by the McKinsey Group that shows diversity does improve your bottom line. Mm-hmm. I think that you a lead in this as well, understanding that not only is it the right thing to do, but it's also profit of the day, right? To have those different voices at the table. And can you go into some detail about the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion and what that means to corporations?
Yeah, I'd love to. Julie, I thought you said it so well. I think the big shift for us has really been, who owns this work too, right? Is it the DEI team? I mean, we've got all purposes, a fairly sizable team at 14, but like 14 people with 70,000 employees at the bank is just not going to get the job done, right? And so that leads us to the business case. And Kenya, such a good question too, because I think you don't even have to look too far, further than the demographics of this country, right? And by 2050, 2055, there's going to be no ethnic majority. So that in and of itself is really the touchstone of the business case. And if you're not focused on diverse segments, it's going to be hard to stay relevant. I think doesn't matter what industry you're in, banking, consumer goods, retail, what have you. We know at the bank that 97% of the growth of our retail footprint is going to come from diverse segments. So that is the growth strategy. It's not even about diverse segments at that point, right? And so you have to be really attuned to the, voice of customer, voice of the employee to grow the business. And I think the shift for us has really been moving away from counting heads, because I think that's what we also tend to, as DEI practitioners, we tend to look at, we're very metrics focused, but it's not just about recruiting. It's got to be about creating a great environment, a great customer experience, no matter who you are. You've got to be attuned and tapped into what that means for different, parts of the population. And again, if you're not going to be relevant. So I think it just comes back to that business case.
That's great. Thank you. And Tanya, with the shift and change in demographics, how is Realogy looking ahead to stay relevant?
And I think, I want to just compliment both Julie and Anne. I think both said it so well. It's all about, at the end of the day, innovation, what fuels innovation, right? And I think we all agree it's people, it's the diversity of people and thought. And then, Anne, you mentioned just the marketplace. They're really, talking about emerging markets, that's no longer the case. We know that, right? We talk about these markets, it's mainstream. And I think companies that understand this is mainstream, will thrive and even remain, relevant and in business at the end of the day. But when you look, I mean, we're all in the people business. So who is buying and selling homes at the end of the day? I mean, and the numbers are there, and it's just for me, and I think for all of us on the call today, it's pretty black and white. I don't know how much more education, needs to be done on that front, because it's pretty crystal clear. But what are we doing? I mean, I do think it comes down to still, because of the reality of the dynamics of the industry, we still know what the stats say. We still know that there's discrimination, some intentional, some not intentional, that takes place in our industry. So it's really about outreach. And, I think, Julia, you might have mentioned it, making certain that you are a place where, anyone can come and thrive and feel that sense of belonging. So on the internal people front, and then on the business side, we've created programs like our recent inclusive ownership program, whereby we're trying to really connect with and bring on board diverse owners of franchise companies. We're trying to help team leaders, create that path to ownership if they want to own their own business and run their own business. And then the same thing at the agent level. And what it takes is outreach. It takes, financial incentives, investing in businesses, right? Like literally, putting your money where your mouth is. But more than that, it takes, programmatic elements to make certain that there's a partnership there and that these companies thrive, because they're such an important part of the economy. So we have a very focused mentoring program for our inclusive ownership companies, as well as executive development, even local PR. Once a company starts their own company for the first time in a local market, like, how do you ensure they do that well? And so we looked at all of the statistics on, new businesses launching, and the success rates are not great. So what can we do to change that? And those are some of the programmatic elements that we offer through this program. And from an eligibility standpoint, we look at, racial and ethnic diversity. We look at LGBTQ plus, we look at women, and we look at veterans from an ownership standpoint. And we're doubling down to, again, try and continue to change that trajectory.
Sounds like investing in people is what this is really about. And that sounds like it's a theme across the board. It's investing in people. It's investing by education and by opportunity. One of the challenges that we see in this space is bias. We all are subject to having bias in life, but it's being able to check that bias before walking into the office. What are you all doing to help educate, in your case, Anne, I guess, consumers, as well as some of your internal hires, on confronting bias or addressing bias in the workplace?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's something that we all have. So we chose to mandate unconscious bias training, for every employee that comes in the door. It's something that we ask them to go through, but there's also ongoing learning, right? Because you've got to continue to sharpen the saw. Even leaders that have been at the company at the top of the house, they need that training too. It might look different. So all levels receive, some degree of DEI training, or as we like to call it, come learn with us, because no one likes to go to a DEI training. I don't even like to go to training. But it's so, training and coaching is key. I think for us too, it's about, again, I just, doubling down on the business opportunity. And I think, Tanya, I loved what you walked through there too. There's so much, I think, that all three of our companies are doing to tap into the core capabilities of what we do as a company. That, to me, that's what I really get excited about. It is driving the equity and the justice focus. So when you think about it, like, how can a bank focus on equity and justice, right? Like, we've got I'll be honest, we've got such a long history of mistrust with communities, and we've earned that mistrust, right? But I think we do have a role to play in building that back. And we can tap into the core capabilities when it comes to home mortgage, right? And hiring people, because there's a business case to go into those markets and actually build. You got to hire Black people if you want to focus on the Black market. Same thing with LGBTQ. And so let that business need really drive, you know, a lot of your focus around people too, I think has been, I think a sea change for us as well at the bank.
Thank you. And Julia Lachey, with the training that you have in place with Keller Williams, how does bias come into the education component?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked. And it's funny that Ann mentions that. I tell people all the time, I'm going to make a t-shirt that says, people who need diversity training don't come to diversity training. We got to call it something different. Two of what I am doing this year is we have a goal of having 10,000 of our agents attend one of two classes that I'm teaching. One is The Color of Real Estate, which talks about the history of real estate and the government's participation in segregation and the barriers, you know, for people of color in getting into homeownership. And then the second one is unconscious bias. And I teach it in a fun, friendly way. And I'm so transparent about my own biases that it makes people comfortable about, let's talk about yours, because we, like you said, Ann, we all have them. And it's not a class about, hey, let's come so we can scold you about your bias. But it's just an eye opener, like consider this, you know, consider these perspectives, ask yourselves these questions, because again, we all have them, but being aware of them and specifically being aware of how we can overcome them. For us, we can't mandate any training. Our franchises are franchisees, right? And we don't have employees, we have independent contractors, 180,000 of them to be exact. So we hope that I'll be influential and entertaining enough to get people to voluntarily attend the unconscious bias training. But the reality behind it is that by you holding on to those biases, you're the one missing out on the opportunities. For us as real estate professionals, right? We get our clients from the general public. And if you're holding on to some biases about certain demographics of people or segments of people, it's you who's missing out, you know? So getting people to understand that those biases are costing us money, you know? And so let's just have an honest conversation about the fact that we all have them. How do we overcome that? And especially in real estate, that bias translates into steering, you know, which translates into segregation. So for us, it's really an important thing that we want to make sure people have a good understanding of. So again, our goal is 10,000 agents this year, which seems small when we have 180,000 associates. But like you said, Ann, people who need diversity training come to diversity training.
Tanya, are you seeing?
I'm with you, Julia. We're same thing. It's really difficult with the reach, right? As far as independent contractor, I hear you. I'm sorry, Kenya.
No, that's what I was going to ask is, are you seeing the same thing? And it sounds like you are.
Yeah, I would say a couple things. I am a big believer of the unconscious bias training. We mandated it first for leaders because we had a different level of training for our leaders, given the role that they play in the company. And then we required it also for all employees. We have about 8,500. So we've extended that, you know, through our agent base, along with, as I mentioned, the customized sort of second level fair housing training for our agents. We had a little over 10,000 participate across our multiple brands. We're looking at what we're going to be rolling out in Q2, I guess, as far as the next level, even after that, because education can never stop, right? This is a really important focus, you know, and I think you said it, like we have a long way to go. So, you know, we just have to continue on this journey. The one thing that I'll share, the reason why I really think that unconscious bias training makes a difference if done right, it gets into the hearts and minds of folks with real stories. And that's what has to happen in the real estate industry, right? Through our agent base, et cetera. If you think about the reach we have within the real estate space, again, in our case, it would be through our agents, but then you're talking about the appraiser business, you're talking about all the ancillary services that come along with that one transaction where this bias in many cases exists. So it's such an extension of what we do, and hence the importance. But I'll share that, you know, when George Floyd was murdered, there was a pivotal point that our company went through, and it was tied to real stories, real experiences from our employees. And, you know, across 8,500 employees, we hosted a town hall meeting, and it was led by our ACE ERG, our African American and Caribbean Employee Resource Group. And they led the town hall meeting that they thought was most appropriate for the employees of our company based on their real experiences. And it was just the most amazing pivotal moment for our company, because it really got into the hearts and minds of our population, and just continuing to, and we all have that opportunity, I think, in our roles through the companies that we represent, to lift those stories up. And that's really where the change starts happening.
I love that example because it resonates, because some people feel if something hasn't happened to them, it isn't real or it doesn't exist. And that's when empathy comes to play, right? And I think that we have to allow ourselves some grace, some empathy, and understanding when we have these conversations. Julie Lachey, you mentioned the historical context. I love the class that you're teaching, The Color of Real Estate, which sounds mirrors The Color of Law, to give really a better perspective of how we got here. And I think sometimes not knowing the history and not understanding where we've been really doesn't help people understand why we have these programs in place. Would you mind elaborating a little bit about how The Color of Law is impacting the training, the education and understanding for your realtors?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is that so many people in general, The Color of Law is really a book about, the history of racism. And so many people in the country don't even understand how that has affected homeownership, education, all of these things. But when we talk about real estate, it amazes me how many realtors have zero idea about the history of the land that we transfer on a daily basis. And over half, I would say, have no idea that the government instituted segregation, that the government created redlining, that the government had racially restrictive covenants, and they have zero idea. And it shocks me, because here we are actively transferring land, and this specifically affects the communities that we live in and serve in, and people don't even know how we got here, like you said. And so particularly we talk about what that means, particularly for us as realtors, and what our role in it is. It was the Realtor Association of Realtors who were advocately against fair housing, who were tremendously against removing racially restrictive covenants. And so now that we have moved past that, what is our role as real estate agents? And so we talk about the history, because we don't learn this stuff in pre-licensing. This is not a part of our pre-licensing education. You don't have to, you need to know how many square feet are in a mile, but you don't have to know anything about the racially restrictive covenants that live in the deeds that we're selling today, So we don't talk about that. So this class is to expose that to our realtors so that they understand the magnitude of our job. We're not just selling houses that look pretty, that have nice windows and furniture, we're actually transferring wealth from one hand to another. And so it's really important to understand the history of that and our role in that, and to take these kind of classes, unconscious bias, and because our role is serious, like this is serious business, and people don't really know that. So the class, The Color of Real Estate, is to just give us a good understanding of what the history is, how we got here, why these home ownership gaps exist, and more importantly, what we can do about it now. And also that a lot of people don't understand, many of the things that we're doing are perpetuating these people think they're ancient, these ancient old practices. Now, these practices are happening yesterday because we haven't really been educated about the fact that we're perpetuating them on a daily basis. So exposing agents to how we're doing that, myself included. I never take myself out of that. Steering, I always tell people, steering is actually hard not to do. We pretend like it's so bad if you steer people to a neighborhood. It's actually hard not to do it. So let's talk about how to actually actively not perpetuate some of these practices that we've grown accustomed to doing, really.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. And, when we talk about The Color of Law, I can't help but touch on something that you mentioned earlier, and that's redlining and the role banks played, not necessarily your bank, but banks in general, and the confidence that the consumer may or may not have because of some of the past. What is U.S. Bank doing to right some of the wrongs of the past?
Yeah, it's a lot of work, and I think U.S. Bank over the past couple of years, because a lot of the, you think about George Floyd's murder, several others in the Twin Cities. I'm sitting here in St. Paul, I could walk to where Philando Castile was murdered too. And I think, this is where US Bank is headquartered. And so for us, this was, I would say, an awakening for a lot of people, a lot of our leaders that sit here, that live here in the community too, and rightfully so, and really challenge themselves to take a step back and say, I'm not sure exactly what to do. I don't think our job here is to solve racism, but we can't sit around and do nothing, because we have perpetuated a lot of the outcomes. When we talk about the racial wealth gap, the 10-to-1 racial wealth gap between white families and Black families that still exists today, right? That's, that is a product of, historic racism, the outcomes and the practices, Julia, that you talked about. At some point, banks have to say, you know what, we caused a lot of that. We perpetuated that. And that's, to me, I think you have to be vulnerable to rebuild some of that trust. And so often you see companies, I think, shy away from making some of those statements. They'll throw billions of dollars at a commitment towards equity, but say very little about how they caused some of it. So, we've been really frank about, this is at the core of, we're never going to be the JP Morgan, the Wells, the top 3 banks that are throwing $1 gazillion at a project like this. It's just not, we just don't have the means to do it. So I think I'm really proud of the way that US Bank has stood up and said, we are a bank, we are going to use the core capabilities of how we run our business to look for ways to drive equity and access to opportunity, because we think that that word is so important. So access to jobs, access to mortgage, access to career pathing if you're an employee, and let that really lead the way. We can't do it all, but I think if we look at each one of our business lines, one of the things we've actually challenged, and I think this has been a differentiator for us, we've challenged our managing committee, so all of the dozen or so reports up to our CEO, to have at least one signature initiative that's tied to equity. So I'll give you an example. In our wealth business, we've got one that's focused on building Black wealth. And so, if you want to have a practice that's focused on building Black wealth, you might want to hire some Black advisors, right? And so let the business again drive, sort of our focus on diversity. And that's been sort of the shift, getting back to the business case, but letting the core capabilities of the business lead us down the path.
Thank you. What's interesting is we have you all here because of your commitment, not only to making a difference in this space, but specifically to the Real Estate Alliance LGBTQ+ organization. And we're very grateful for not only your commitment, but for what you're actually doing. You've been intentional about being involved in this space. And as we wrap up, I'd just like to know, what can we do to better partner with you through education and through other means to really help home ownership for the LGBTQ+ community through the initiatives that you have in place with your organizations? And I'll start with you, Tanya.
So I think we've been fortunate because we've been partnered for a long time, and many of the outstanding members and leaders of the Alliance I've known for so many years, and we've worked at this together and made a difference, be it through education, be it through outreach. I think, as of late, what's really been beneficial from a partnership standpoint is sort of line of sight. And I say that because I can count on the team here if they see or hear of any sort of wrongdoing, right, with anyone that represents, the company as an independent contractor, what have you, specifically on social media, et cetera. There's an awareness, there's, hey, Tanya, team, et cetera, this is what we're seeing. Because at the end of the day, I think what's critical, we've all talked about education and the wonderful work we're doing and the programming and what have you, and our leadership commitments. It comes down to action, right? What we do and every action matters and every interaction matters. So that's been really helpful from a partnership standpoint. And that also lends to just the courage that, one has, be it a leader or be it a company, to stand up for what you believe in, what you stand for. And I think I shared with this team here, and again, I had many discussions with folks from the Alliance when this occurred, but I had been recognized for some of these efforts, specifically in the LGBTQ plus community, and sort of word got out, right? Which I and others were loud and proud about. And we were in the midst of a deal, and you know, the prospect basically said, "Hey, I'm out. I can't believe that you guys, right? You leader, you company endorsed this." And so, and again, in partnership here with some of the leaders that represent the LGBTQ plus alliance, it was just, you know, an easy decision. Our leader basically said, you know, thank you for letting us know that we're not aligned early on, so that we didn't have any of these issues down the line. And so just that support and that partnership really continues to make such a difference for us.
Thank you. Anne?
Yeah, I think, you know, this has been such a wonderful opportunity, I think, to learn from each other too. You know, when we think about the alliance, you know, we tend to think about a focus on LGBTQ, but, you know, we know that even the LGBTQ space has tended to really focus on, you know, certain populations and kind of at the expense of others too. And I think there's an opportunity to continue to forge intersectionality, and, you know, we're stronger together when we all work together. And, you know, we're all learning. Like, US Bank doesn't have it all figured out. And I think this is just such a great forum to continue to pressure test the work, to do better, to expect great things. US Bank is excited to be a part of it. I continue to be excited to be a part of it. And thanks again for the time on today's panel.
Thank you. And Julia
And for
Lachey.
us, yes, Kenya, for us, we're super excited to be about this. Is actually our first partnership with any trade organization. We have never ventured down this road before, and what better organization could we partner with? For us, it's tremendously beneficial to be engaged in all of the things that you guys are doing. You're a very active organization, and provide so much training and opportunities. It allows us to be able to, we do have internal ERGs as well, and we do have a KW Rainbow Network that is a very long-standing organization internally, that they are a great networking, but being partnered with the Alliance allows us to get the information and education and to have something to offer our associates as we continue to grow, you know, our initiatives here. Again, we being very transparent, we're new on this journey, you know, and so we need all the friends we can make, you know, so we're out here making friends and kissing babies. And this is a really great friendship. And we are more than honored to be in partnership with you. And thank you so much for the invitation today.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all. It's amazing to have wonderful partners and allies in this industry, and you all are bright examples of that. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, and thank you for all that you do to continue to elevate this conversation in our industry. So I'd like to say thank you, Julia Lachey with Williams. Thank you, Ann Dicey with US Bank, and thank you, Tanya Rue Navarez with Realogy. You all have been excellent examples of true servant leadership and allies in this space. And on behalf of the Alliance, I'd like to say thank you so much for your support, and thank you to each of you who have joined us today. It is true, when we're all in, we all win.